but this little pointer clicker thing that I use every week to shift the slideshow, it drains batteries like you wouldn't believe. It's not like your remote at home. Those things last forever, and you go, oh, but the batteries are out, you're trying to press it. This thing, this just drains batteries like I don't believe. Last week we talked about the public ministry of Jesus, and how he was ending up his final summation. How John was ending one book. It's called the Book of Signs, where John puts all his signs together for who Jesus is, and that he kind of starts a more private, more intimate ministry here in chapter 13. And so it's kind of like we're getting behind the scenes look. It's like we're going into the judge's chambers, just the attorneys and the client maybe, and we're seeing what's going on behind the scenes. And this is an important point to kind of remind us of how John has organized his gospel. We said that way back in the beginning, I think the very first lesson on this. And so John, we've seen the prologue. He does an introduction to who Jesus is from the very beginning, that he's been there from the beginning. And then the public ministry is what we've been going through so far. The first 12 chapters is Jesus teaching to the crowds, the miracles to the crowds, all of the 7 signs that John points out to who he is. And then here in chapter 13 we start what's considered his private ministry. And that together with the next couple chapters of Passion ministry is called the Book of Glory. We got the Book of Signs and the Book of Glory. Kind of you think pointing towards Christ, and then his glory being revealed in these books. And so what's happening here in 13 is Jesus starts to prepare his disciples for the coming darkness of what's going to take place. And he'll encourage them, and he'll pray for them, and he'll say what he expects from them. And so let's just start reading chapter 13. Before the Passover celebration, Jesus knew that his hour had come to leave this world and return to his Father. He had loved his disciples during the ministry on earth, and now he loved them to the very end. It was time for supper, and the devil had already prompted Judas, son of Simon Iscariot, to betray Jesus. Jesus knew that the Father had given him authority over everything, and that he had come from God and returned to God. So he got up from the table, took off the robe, wrapped a towel around his waist, and poured water into a basin. Then he began to wash the disciples' feet, drying them with the towel he had around him. I'm going to stop there. Jesus knows that ultimate power is his. He knows that God has given him everything. Authority for everything is under his command. And what does he do with it? He stands up, he kneels in front of the people who are his students, his people he's been teaching, and he washes their feet. He takes a towel, and he bends down, and he cleanses their feet. Now, foot washing was common in that time. It was something that you did as a courtesy. When you came into somebody's house, you expected you would get your feet washed from the dusty roads, and you would have your feet washed, and it happened almost when you came inside the door. But Jesus is doing this when supper has already been taking place. They're eating a supper, and Jesus gets up during this supper and starts washing their feet, starts kneeling down and washing their feet. So there's got to be something more to this. He's making a point. Jesus is making some sort of a point with this. Luke's gospel records the same dinner, the same supper taking place. And at the supper, he doesn't record the foot washing, but he records something else. He records an argument that takes place with the disciples. And it says this. They argued, and they argued about who's the greatest. And Jesus tells them, in the world, the kings and great men lord it over their people, but among you it will be different. Those who are the greatest among you should take the lowest rank, and the leader should be like a servant. You see, Luke doesn't talk about the foot washing, but can you see Jesus sort of getting up and responding to this discussion? The disciples are having this discussion, and he says, no, this is not what's supposed to be. And so he gets up, and he gives them a visual example of what he's talking about here. And John focuses on this, says, look, this is going to sear itself in your minds in the future. And then the story continues. Peter says, he goes around the table and he starts washing feet. And Peter says, Lord, don't wash my feet. You're not my servant. And Jesus tells him, well, if I don't wash you, then you're not with us. And Peter says, well, then wash everything. Wash my hands and my head. Wash everything. And Jesus says, no, that's not what I'm talking about. You don't have to bathe. You don't have to be cleansed. If you're one of my followers, you've already been cleansed. That's not what I'm talking about. That's not what me kneeling down washing your feet is about. And he tells them what it's about. He says, after washing their feet, he puts on his robe, he sits down and he says, do you understand what I was doing? You call me teacher and Lord, and you're right, because that's what I am. And since I, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you ought to wash each other's feet. I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Now, does that mean Jesus telling everybody from here on out to wash each other's feet? A ritual, like a church ritual that we come in, we're supposed to wash each other's feet? Some have interpreted it that way, that we should have a foot washing ritual. I'm not washing anybody's feet. I'm not washing any of y'all's feet when we come in next time. I've washed people's feet before to talk about this lesson. But Jesus is giving an object lesson. He's giving them something that later on, when they become the leaders of the church, and they will, and they're tempted to take power and authority and control and lord it over the people who come and ask them questions. And we see that in Acts 15. That people are asking them questions about something. That they will go back and they'll go, wait a minute. You remember what he did back there? You remember how our God knelt before us and washed our feet? A visual object lesson that will stick in their heads for how they are supposed to interact with each other and how they are supposed to treat each other. That no act of service is beneath them. No menial task should not be done by them. And they're serving each other the same way that he served them. And so then Jesus, he gets up and he teaches them this, and he continues to tell them, and he's going to prepare them for a shocking truth. And it's something that they should have seen coming. He's talked about things for so long, but they don't. He says, I am not saying these things to all of you. I know the ones I have chosen. But this fulfills the scripture that says, the one who eats my food is turned against me. I tell you this beforehand, so that when it happens, you will believe that I am the Messiah. Now Jesus was deeply troubled, and he exclaimed, I tell you the truth, one of you will betray me. So in the midst of this, he's continuing to show them that he's the Messiah, because that's the purpose. I mean, John makes sure he records this because this is his point, showing who Jesus is. And he knows what's going on. He wants his disciples to know that, look, when all this goes down, I'm in control. I knew this was going to happen. Don't think that my enemy's got the best of me, because I told you about this beforehand. He's going to betray me. One of you is going to betray me. And he quotes this prophecy from Psalm 41. The one who eats my food is turned against me. This is a specific prophecy. It mentions food. It mentions bread. This is eating together. It's a very intimate thing. That eating a meal together was a very close fellowship thing. The phrase, turned against me, literally says, lifted up his heel to me. So imagine a horse kicking. It's like a metaphor of a horse picking up his heel and kicking somebody. During that time, you also maybe remember the story of Jesus and his disciples saying, dust your feet off, leave this town and shake the dust off your feet. Even today in that culture, in the Middle Eastern culture, to Arabs, lifting up your foot and pointing your foot at them is a sign of discourtesy and even hostility. And so this idea of the foot turning against you, your foot picking up against you, is a sign of hostility. So this prophecy is talking about an intimate person, somebody that he would share a meal with, betraying him. And he tells them, he says, look guys, this is going to happen so that you know who I am. So that later on you'll be able to go back and say, oh yeah, he did tell us about that. They didn't get to him. He told us this was going to happen. And so then John and Peter get together, and Peter says, who is this guy? Who's the one that's going to do it? And Peter tells John, who's referred to as the beloved disciple. John never refers to himself in this gospel. Peter says, John, find out who that is. And John says, Jesus, who is this guy who's going to betray you? Jesus responds, it is the one to whom I give the bread I dip in the bowl. And when he had dipped it, he gave it to Judas, son of Simon Iscariot. When Judas had eaten the bread, Satan entered into him. Then Jesus told him, hurry and do what you're going to do. None of the others at the table knew what Jesus meant. Since Judas was their treasurer, some thought Jesus was telling him to pay for food or give money to the poor. So Judas left at once, going out into the night. Okay, so the disciples don't know what's going on. That's what it says, right? Are they dumb? Are they not paying attention? I mean, that's what it says they don't understand what's going on, right? He just said, I'm going to give the bread that I dipped to somebody, and that's the man. And they don't get it. Here's one thing I think is going on. Peter and John are sitting close to Jesus. It's the typical seats of right and left-hand man. They're the right and left-hand men of Jesus. And Peter says, John, hey, John, ask him what he's talking about. You kind of see a mini conversation going on amongst a lot of conversations. Pay attention at the luncheon after here. See if that goes on. You're talking to these people, and you don't know what's going on over here. And so he tells John this answer. He says, John, the one who I dipped this bread to is gonna be the one. And so not everybody has to hear this. We assume, okay, he's talking to all the disciples. But it's sort of implied here that they don't hear the whole discussion. And because they say, well, Judas is the treasurer. Maybe he's just going and giving stuff to the poor. They don't seem to know that there's something else going on here. So why doesn't John speak up? If it's just John he tells it to, why doesn't John speak up? Well, again here, there's no indication in any of these scriptures that Jesus means that this betrayal is going to happen immediately, eminently. That this could go on later in the future on the disciples. You think we're on this side of the cross. We know we're Monday morning quarterbacks. We know how it ends. We know what's going to happen. And so we look back and we say, well, don't they see? But you got to remember they're on that side of it. And even though they've kind of been told this stuff, he's not being the one that they expect him to be. And so they don't see the cross. And they don't understand what's going on. And so Judas getting up and leaving and going and doing his duties as treasurer is not a big deal to them. I want to look at this phrase, going out into the night. It's nighttime, it's dinner time, he's leaving, and it's chronologically, it's night. But it's a little bit more than that. That Judas is leaving the light of the world. That earlier, John does this whole section metaphor with saying Jesus is the light of the world. And John gets up and Satan has entered him and he has betrayed Jesus. He is leaving the light and going into the dark. His soul is now dark. His soul is night within him. When the traitor is gone, when the betrayal has happened, Jesus then has his intimate friends still there, the ones who are his true friends. And he turns to them and he says, Dear children, I will be with you only a little longer. And as I told the Jewish leaders, you will search for me, but you can't come where I am going. So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you. You should love each other. Your love for one another will prove to the world that you are my disciples. Jesus says he's given them a new commandment. But it's not new. It's fresh in what he's telling them, because this is from the old law. In Leviticus 19:18, it talks about loving each other. Loving each other. This is not something the Jews were unfamiliar with. But it's important because, you notice I underlined all the words love. 6 times in this chapter talks about love. And in fact, more times in these sections that we're going to look at in the next few weeks, love is mentioned more than at any time in the previous 12 chapters. So this is a big deal. It's important. What type of love is he talking about? He says, love just as I have loved you. It's a love within a community of believers. A community of believers that is created because of Christ's love for us. It's a new commandment because it's something that has not been experienced before. It's more of a fresh. Think of it more as fresh instead of new. And these communities that are created, they're known, he says, they're known by how they love each other. It says your love for one another will prove that you're my disciples. John further explains what he means later on. What type of love this is. In a letter that he writes to these Christians many years later, in 1 John 3, he says, we know what real love is because Jesus gave up his life for us. So we also ought to give our lives for our brothers and sisters. If someone has enough money to live well and sees a brother or sister in need, but shows no compassion, how can God's love be in that person? Jesus is talking about a sacrificial love. A sacrificial love. This is the new kind of love, the fresh kind of love that he's telling his disciples about. That we submit to each other. That we're willing to give up our money, our time, our energy, our very lives to assist and submit our fellow believers. And I notice he talks about one another, that the love for one another will prove that you are my disciples. And this is not the love of a mighty king who they thought he would be. This is the love of a humble carpenter who kneels down and washes the feet even of the person that wanders off into the night to betray him. That's the kind of sacrificial love that he's talking about. In the following verse in 1 John, it says, "Dear children, let's not merely say that we love each other. Let's show the truth by our actions." Show the truth by our actions. That the love Jesus speaks of is sacrificial, and it's demonstrated. It's a demonstrated love. Jesus said, "Love one another will prove that you are my disciples." And the early church, they got this. They got this idea of loving means taking action and helping each other. Look what the book of Acts says about the early believers. Right after the church is just booming and exploding, it says the believers met together in one place, shared everything they had. They sold their property and possessions, shared all the money with those in need, all the while praising God, and then they enjoyed the goodwill of all the people. The early church knew what Jesus was talking about. We think we're the early church. We like to think we're like the early church. But I submit we're not as much like the early church as we think we are. These guys took care of their needy. They took care of their poor. They took care of their widows. They made sure everybody had what they needed. And people saw. They enjoyed the goodwill of all the people. And the church kept growing and kept exploding because these people were showing love to each other. And it was demonstrated so much that historians comment, look at those Christians, see how they love each other? They called their communion meals love feasts because it was all about loving each other. Do we have love feasts or do we have joyless rituals? Do we go to church or are we the church? These guys, these believers, they understood that they were the church. The church was them. They didn't go to a building on Sunday morning. They didn't go to church. I think we need to change that language. We need to change those words. Be intentional about what we say. We don't go to church because we are the church. And these people got it. They served each other the same way that Christ served them. Paul puts it this way in 1 Corinthians. We have all been baptized into one body by one Spirit. And we all share the same Spirit. If one part suffers, they all suffer. If one part is honored, they are all glad. All of you together are Christ's body, and each of you is a part of it. We are a body. One body. There's a Casting Crowns song. Casting Crowns is a contemporary Christian group. Casting Crowns song called If We Are the Body. It's a great song. It makes a point about treating people equally. Treating everybody that walks in, that you see, as equal on the same playing field. And some of the lyrics say, if we are the body, why aren't his arms reaching? Why aren't his hands healing? Why aren't his words teaching? Why aren't his feet going? Jesus paid too high a price for us to pick and choose who should come. Yeah, it's about reaching out. It's about outreach. And we focus on that we should be reaching out. And yes, we should be focused on outreach and about being outward focused. But you notice here, Jesus said that you will be known by how you love each other, how you love one another. That it's not just about out there, it's about what's going on in here. Do we really want to bring others into our dysfunctional family? Is that it? That's what we want? Is the body who we run to when we're in need, when we're in trouble? Does the body step out and take care of itself when they see a need? We rely on, and these things are not wrong. They're not bad. I'm not saying they are. But we rely on health insurance when we get sick. We rely on FEMA to clean up the disasters when they take place. We rely on assistance and support on Social Security when our widows get old, when our people get so old they can't take care of themselves at Social Security. The church has let this stuff happen because the body has not taken care of itself. The body is not supporting each other and providing and making sure each other has what they need. And so, how do we handle when we offend each other? How do we handle that? Do we forgive each other the way Christ says to forgive? Do we serve each other the way we should be serving each other? Make allowance for each other's faults and forgive anyone who offends you. Remember, the Lord forgives you. The Lord forgave you, so you must forgive others. But are we that different than the rest of the world? What do they see when we grumble and when we have arguments with each other? Do they see us holding on to that grudge and never letting go of it and ruining the bonds of a once good friendship? Or do they see us quickly forgiving and being patient with each other's faults and repairing those bonds that were broken? Because that's what Christ wants from his body, is to forgive and to love and to submit to one another. Does the outside world know Jesus' followers by how we love each other? Because if we're the body of Christ, what do we do to show it? What are we doing to show that? Some of we claim to die for him. I mean, we say, oh, Jesus, I will do whatever for you. I will die for you. We want to say that. We want to believe that about ourselves. And Peter did too. At the end of this chapter, the last few things, Peter says, Lord, I'm willing to die for you. He says, I want to come with you. I'm going to die for you. And Jesus says, die for me? No, you're going to deny me. You're going to deny me 3 times. And we know the story of Peter denying him. Peter's denial was just as much a betrayal as Judas's betrayal was. The difference in their stories is that Peter didn't allow his guilt to overwhelm him. He allowed God's love to embrace him and to overwhelm him, and he came back. He came back. We betray Christ every day in our words, in our actions. I betray Christ. Lack of action. But he's ready to embrace us. He's ready to empower us to love each other and to serve each other the way that he expects us to, the way that he served and loved us. He calls each of us to love just as he loved, in submission, with sacrifice, making sure everybody is taken care of. It all starts with loving him. It starts with loving Jesus, loving him first, and making a commitment to him. And do we make that commitment to him? Do we show and declare to everyone, hey, I love you, God, and I'm willing to leave my sinful life behind? And if you haven't been baptized, that's where it starts. Leaving the sinful life behind at the bottom of that water and coming up and starting fresh, starting new. But it's more than that. Even if you have been, it's leaving old grudges behind. It's leaving those things behind that we have issues with people, because that's not loving each other. That's not the body taking care of itself and healing itself. When your body has been hurt, it needs to heal. And we put Band-Aids, we put ointments, we try to heal. We try to heal ourselves. It has to take place here in this body too. If you have a problem with somebody, if you have a grudge with somebody, if you have something against somebody, don't leave here until you take care of it. Until you go to him and say, hey, I love you, I'm sorry, this is dumb, we shouldn't be doing this, and fix the bond. Because that's what loving each other, just as Jesus loved, is submitting to each other and not letting those little things take precedence. So think about those things and don't let it go while we stand and sing and praise God.